Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another meeting of the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group. My name is Mike Canacass, as some people say, here with my partner, Phil Bossman. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing very well, boss man.
Today is a little bit of a different meeting. Phil and I are not close to each other as usual. I am on the West Coast and Phil is on the East Coast. And so we're about 3,000 miles apart, but we're doing our thing. And tonight we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, or let's say one of the most frustrating subjects for me, which is this idea that PowerShell is bad and it needs to be shut off by default. It's a vector for bad stuff, and security wants to shut it down. So tonight, we are going to be talking with our guest, Mysul, who we'll introduce in just a minute, who's going to talk about how we can get PowerShell blessed in the environment and show them that it's a tool for good and not necessarily a vector for evil. And so with that, um, we'd like to welcome in Mr. Sewell. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for
Awesome.
asking.
Yeah, thank you for joining us tonight. And so this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because nothing annoys me more than when I started a new job like I just did recently, and people say, oh, you can't use PowerShell in the environment. That's security thinks it's the worst thing in the world. And if we turn that on, we're immediately going to get owned. And so it's a very frustrating thing. And I think you're here to give us some help and some guidance in how we can sort of make the case that PowerShell is not the worst thing in the world. Is this correct?
I would say that's accurate and fair representation and marketing of my intent.
Yeah. So Phil, what's your experience? Have you encountered environments and people that assume PowerShell must be off by default?
I think, I've been a big proponent of actually pushing against those things and addressing them individually. And I think I've been very lucky in my role is to actually show them that you can use that for tooling. And certainly for those who are, kind of just turn it on without their approval kind of thing. So it's kind of a sneak it in going, hey, that's already been there, or the reverse of, hey, well, this is needed for this purpose. And then you don't tell them that there's another option. And so that other point is that it's this idea like, oh, but you're leaving, RPC open, you're leaving all this other stuff open, but what are you doing? What are you talking about with, PowerShell is this thing? Well, VBScript is going to do a whole bunch of other stuff, all these other things. If you can't turn on your, probably Mike's going to start talking about some other stuff. This idea of like, hey, you got to audit, you got to do some other stuff. Like that, you got to have some other tooling. You should need to know what it is. But the security team is also, they know my name, going, oh, should we just, wipe this Phil? Because all the stuff he does, he just sparks all of that kind of stuff. So it's kind of it's unique in my role in that I'm the one who's actually, flagging all those alerts. So I keep sending emails, it's only me, it's only me, it's only me. So that's kind of the fun thing with me. So I'm gonna go back to you, Mike. What's your experience?
Myself?
No, Mike, the other Mike in the room.
Well, before we do that, I was going to say, let's not get too far down the road. Want to give Mike a chance to introduce himself and let the audience know a little bit about who he is and what his role that he fulfills so that people have a little context. So, Mike, give us a little window into what your day-to-day life is like.
Chaos. But no, so yeah, I'm a director. I live in Arizona, but I've lived throughout the Midwest too, and definitely love using PowerShell. Been using it for years, and it's my language of choice. And so it's a really good vehicle just to have some conversations with a lot of our clients about. And that I work for an MSSP, and so we see a little bit of a lot. And I know it's everything from one story I'll tell during the presentation, but even the other day, to Phil's point, like we had one of our team leads download AD Recon, like a PowerShell script, and run it, and all of a sudden SOC alerts start going off, and it's like, it's not malicious, but it's been used by malicious actors, and there's a negative connotation there, and so there's some re-education and some just discussion of what is PowerShell and how is it secure.
Yeah, one of the things I think that most people don't realize is Microsoft has actually built a huge tool set for you to run PowerShell the right way. And so while the answer, the idea that PowerShell must be shut off by default is wrong, there's also a case to be made that just turning on PowerShell by default is also not the right case. And Microsoft has given some pretty extensive tools for you to be able to really tailor that, which I'm sure Mike's going to talk about. But this is one of the cases where Microsoft has done a really outstanding job in helping you set up your environment to be very secure.
Agreed.
All right, so Mike, we could turn it over to you. We're going to be here watching along with everybody else. We'll ask some questions along the way, but why don't you take it away?
Perfect. Please do too. Quick story, like I was mentioning. All right. If PowerPoint works, we'll chalk that one up to Copilot. There we go. All right. So we're doing work and we see some text like this start scrolling across the screen, right? This may show up in a log. This may show up in an alert somewhere. And all of a sudden we're like, what is that gobbledygook? Some of us here immediately are like, oh, that starts to look like hex characters. But for a SOC analyst, they may just be like, what is that? What's going on here? And this happened. We saw this type of activity from a threat actor in log events. And so explaining to our team, digging in. So that's hex encoding for random characters. And hex encoding has two different types. And since it's a /x, we know it's a printable character. It's representing some ASCII value. And so something like /x74, we can convert that from base 16 into an ASCII integer. So hex is base 16, ASCII is base 10, 74 becomes 116. And if we in PowerShell just cast that to a character, we get back T. So all that fanciness just to get the letter T printed out on the screen. And so we can take that, we can say, hey, we got a clean string. We're going to take that string. We want to be able to convert some of this. And so all those conversations about awesome regex patterns, we can use regex and say, hey, we're going to find the instance of that backslash. We're going to find the instance of that X, and then we're going to capture the two characters after it. We're going to loop through those characters and say, cool, let's see what we convert all of those values to. And we replace that in our clean string. Wow, we've got some JavaScript targeting. So this was obviously just one single line of a larger event and a larger file, but this is a good example of we as security resources can use PowerShell as a powerful tool, just like a threat actor may be using PowerShell in their environments or our environments against us.
So Michael, I just want to ask you, so the point you're driving out here is the whole purpose of what you just went through is someone's trying to hide their tracks, right? They're trying to stay out of the view of and move around the network essentially, right?
Exactly. This ended up being a JavaScript embedded payload that they reversed out. And basically, if somebody clicked on it, then it started doing a remote access Trojan. So it was basically a phone home script disguised as a pretty web page.
So it's code that's legit. It's just not something that a human eye can pick up at first glance. And so if you don't know what you're looking at, you let it go, possibly. Yep. Right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's one of those things, right? Like if you aren't paying attention to that, or if you are trying to match very specific keywords or phrases, keep in mind there's ways to obfuscate that. So hide that and convert that in ways that may not be obvious. And you've got to consider those edge cases. Great call out though, Mike. As a note too, so this is the way you want to do it, the hard mode. I talk with Doug Fink a lot, who authored the PSAI module, and I'm realizing that I'm the problem now that we have AI tools, because now I could just send that string to OpenAI and it's just going to do all the work for me. Now, there's benefit in understanding how all this stuff works. So it's good to go through the first process, but there are faster ways. And this is just a quick example of using PSAI. And so essentially just a quick recap of this, because there's some shorthand in here. I just invoke expression, and then I invoke an expression for a secret that's stored in my local key vault. And that local vault is just a hash table of the settings that I pass in as my secret string. So my API key, my user identity, my instance URL, and my secret key. And I just pass that in, so that also my secrets never show up in my logs, which is something we'll talk about too, that the PowerShell team's done a good job at hiding. But we as users of PowerShell should still avoid putting any plain text secret material out there. So once I've got my environment set up, I just invoke an OAI chat. You could do this with an agent too, and just pass it in the content that you want, and it'll decode it for you. Pretty nifty. So PowerShell, it's bad, disable it. No, it's actually good. We just have to be really understanding of the risks and benefits. And to do that, there's different teams in our organizations that will speak different language. To them, they'll just see PowerShell in the news. They'll see that such and such threat actor used it. It may be that Honey Bear threat actor. We give them really weird code names these days, but Pooh Bear out there is attacking our organizations, I suppose. So we have to help them understand how PowerShell is used, the benefits, and then also how we mitigate the risks of that. The nuance with risk is it's sort of this probability that something could happen. So an example I always like to reference is from college. I had a professor that's like, we're technically on the glide plane for the airport, but what's the likelihood a plane's going to crash into our building? It's a low probability event. But what's the impact? The impact's massive. So the FAA, as a regulatory agency, is taking precautions around that. They implement policy and requirements of pilots to be able to understand how to handle emergency situations and try to avoid crash landing into an occupied space. So that's an extreme example, but really what a risk is that probability and that impact if we're quantifying it.
So safe to say, since you're here tonight, that we did not have an impact on your building?
Correct. Very fortunate. I flew American this morning. Love the pilots, the first officers, and all of the staff that got me here safely.
Nice, nice.
So when we're talking about risk, though, similar to that example with the FAA, there's these risk management frameworks we have. And within organizations, you may be in an organization where you have governance, risk, and compliance as a team that's really worried about risk management. Or you may be in a financial institution and they may have a financial risk management team where they're much more financial based. These are just different organizational functions, operations that will vary by your organization, and you'll find that your organization may have this, they may care about what you're working in, they may not. But if we look at the bottom here, we've got more of these financial centric or service centric. So you'll see FRM more in banks, credit unions, investment firms, that type of organization. And as you get into ISO, you'll see ISO more in like a services business, like either MSPs, you may see it with lawyer firms, any sort of professional services organization, you'll see them basing a lot of processes off ISO. You also have FAIR, which is a quantitative focus. So I mentioned risk is probability and impact. They take that to the extreme and really say every risk has a potential value. And we gauge the value of risks and their impact based on that value. And then you get into IT centric, and we have so many options. There's NIST has their risk management framework. ITIL has this baked into it as a function, a practice area. COBIT has this. And this is just scratching the surface, right? So there's all these options. The general concept, though, is just keeping in mind that there's a lot of groundwork already laid here, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel unless we're trying to make another USB standard, right? So we all love XKCD comics. I love them. USB is pretty ridiculous in their adaptation of this, but the reality is there are improvements, but we can handle that in versioning sometimes better than creating entirely new things. So one last note, this is just a helpful view. I always like to sort of chat through this because it gets really confusing depending on your organization. If you're in a firm that has FRM functions, they probably don't really care about IT risk. That's probably not their priority. That's probably not their core operational function. But as you get into GRC and governance risk compliance as a core capability, that's typically going to care about IT. You're not their only focus. You're not their primary focus necessarily, but typically it's going to be an offshoot of security. If you've grown an operations team where you've got dedicated security resources, they're probably the ones focusing on it. Or if you've grown to the point where your legal team cares about it, that's typically sort of the maturity brackets I've seen is either your operations team is doing it out of necessity, your security team's doing it from an initial compliance standpoint, or your legal team is really driving this because it directly impacts contracts. It may directly impact your ability to stay funded. It may directly impact your ability to mitigate being in the news. There's lots of different considerations when we're talking about operational risk for an organization. So a lot to unpack. I'm going a little quick, but certainly happy to take questions if anybody has questions or thoughts about this, or even everybody has experience too. This is a big area.
Hey, Mike, I was looking at the code that you were showing a few back, and what was the purpose of all those hex codes in the command?
Yeah, good question. So the intent here was, and AI does a good example of this, as soon as this is unobfuscated and we see the plain text view of it, AI is just like immediately, this is JavaScript. So you may have indicators or queries or threat hunting practices and workbooks that are looking for this very specific key phrase as, oh, we likely are dealing with some form of JavaScript. But by obfuscating that and hiding those ASCII characters as hex characters, we're now able to say, well, that looks funky. All of our automated procedures didn't catch that. So that's really what we were doing in this code, is just cleaning up that because somebody was trying to hide this well-known and fairly obvious indicator from us. Good question.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because I've seen this kind of thing before, but the last time I remember seeing it, they were trying to launch applications in paths, and so they're hiding the path string with a bunch of hex code. And one of the craziest ones I saw was they were using the back place character. So they were moving the cursor backwards and then writing over the characters that came before it. That was a wild one. It took me a while to figure that one out.
Yeah, backtracking on itself to change
Uh-huh.
characters. Yeah,
Yep.
some of these threat actors get pretty creative, and once you find the pattern, it's obvious, but it takes a lot to find that pattern, right?
Yep. Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, there's a whole school of theory around cryptography and all of this obfuscation. So, like Caesar ciphers are sort of that basic example. Shift ciphers are what they're also called, but you can definitely get into extremely complex concepts with some of this stuff. So there's lots of fun capture the flag type engagements out there that are more friendly if you want to see some of the crazier stuff too. And yeah, definitely what Stephen was mentioning is not too uncommon. It's definitely out there. Good input. So if we know GRC is valuable for explaining to the business what the impact of risk is, and we want to be able to communicate the value of PowerShell. So risk is why we're doing something. We're trying to prevent risk. We're trying to mitigate risk. We're trying to limit risk. Compliance, so the C in GRC, is what we must do from a regulatory standpoint, from a contractual liability standpoint, from a commitment standpoint. It's what we've committed to as an organization. It's what we agree to either implicitly or explicitly as an organization that we'll do. And then governance is what we actually do to mitigate risk and meet our compliance obligations. And so it would be really nice if it's just the we're here story, right? You walk up to the map, you know where you're at, and you know where you want to go. The reality of the story is a little bit more complex. We've got Sarah's team doing some stuff. She's got a few projects going. And then we probably got Frank's team over here doing some stuff, and they're doing some things. And then we got Mike's team doing these things that are a little random and out there. So we sort of end up in this stage, and this is only 3 teams, right? So if you have a GRC team, like I mentioned, IT's on their roadmap, but they're looking at organizational risk, and they've got potentially hundreds of teams, depending on the size of your organization, dealing with this and trying to map this out and figure out, are we doing everything we need to and within the tolerances of the organization's risk? And by the way, you probably got some random group like mine over there doing random stuff that nobody really understands and is just using it to fund projects through Bitcoin mining because, yeah, why not? Sometimes you got to have fun with things. So if we've got this mess, we need a path to succeed, right? Compliance Forge has some amazing resources out there, so please check them out. This is something that they publish free, and this is a great just placemat of what are we dealing with when we're talking about IT risk management. Please don't try to read every little bit, but we'll walk through some of the components as I like to coach through them. So if you're in an IT ops role, you're dealing with a lot of procedures from a compliance, a GRC security perspective. So you're usually trying to make sure that procedures are accurate, make sure that you're actually implementing things as intended, and you're really focused on making sure that the environment's functional in a certain way. Sometimes if you're doing some observability and you're more on the infrastructure and operations side, the DevOps mindset, you'll probably be getting into metrics and how do we measure that our procedures are actually effective. In security, there's a little bit more context to that. We also need to understand that there's all of these internal and external influencers over here. So we shared some abbreviations, but this is where we get into PCI, SOC, ISO, NIST. You may have CMMC, you may have HIPAA, you may have your state and local regulations, you may have like GDPR if you're a European Union entity. That's where we get into what's influencing what we need to do. And we need to all agree, operations security and the GRC team, what matters here, because this is definitely influencing just about everything else in this map. So if we agree there, we know what policies, written policies, the organization should implement, what controls those policies are going to be used to actually get implemented. Because one thing I always like to say, if you have a written policy and you have no way to control that policy, you only have liability. So keep that in mind, that sometimes organizations may not necessarily have a written policy because there is no adequate way to manage to that policy. So all of these things get really nuanced and every organization handles them slightly different. But as we sort of talked through, this all maps together, and then you've got your risks, so the things that you intend to mitigate, and your threats, the things that should be mitigated or managed. Quick note too, I'm a little bit of a disagreement in the way they reference policies and standards. Not that they're wrong, just I always caution any organization, no matter your size, you likely don't need to be authoring standards. You should reference open standards and you should be using technical open standards. And then your organization may have internal standards specific to risk management. The nuance there, a technical open standard specification like USB or OpenID Connect OIDC, those are very specific things where your internal standards, you may have those as an organization, but typically until you get to a multiple operating company entity, it's really hard to justify, oh yeah, we're doing standardization as one entity. Usually that's going to come into the picture if you have multiple operating entities and you're really trying to scale out and manage through policy different entities in different ways. And that's setting your baseline across all entities and allowing them to handle their exceptions from those standards differently. So there's layers to all of this, but Compliance Forage's documentation is a great starting point. They've got comparison definitions between how ISO defines risk versus NIST defines risk and all of that nuance. So great resource, tremendous team over there. Another awesome team is the MITRE team. They publish the attack framework and they actually document PowerShell specifically as a risk in that framework. So one area is PowerShell as the scripting interpreter, the actual programming language itself. We've got this threat. We've got all these different considerations that we could mitigate it with or consider mitigations for. And we're going to touch on all those. We're going to walk through all of that because these are good conversations to have with the business. And these help you map your controls, what you can do, into the policy that the business would want to enforce. So yes, there is the recommendation to disable or remove it outright. You can do that, but ideally you're able to explain the benefits and the mitigations for these other concerns so that you can make sure that it's actually useful, not just turned off. This is one great example where they do document a persistence technique or an elevation technique. is maliciously manipulating profiles for PowerShell to be able to execute code when an admin signs in or an admin launches a new shell session, being able to continually basically just re-engage the system through those profiles. So that's another consideration, is your profiles that get installed, and you may or may not even have configured in some systems, could be used against you. And all of these things are hard to keep mapped. So that's where frameworks using mapping concepts and identifications like the MITRE attack, being able to actually put a specific identifier to these things is super valuable. So limiting PowerShell risks, we'll run through these, get into some examples, and then we can start diving into some code examples of this as well. So using PowerShell to protect PowerShell because PowerShell's the risk. Yeah, that's getting confusing, but PowerShell's awesome. So anything could have happened. How do we avoid that? Well, PowerShell has audit logging. We can get very verbose in that. Most organizations should have a modern endpoint detection and response solution. Most modern EDRs have behavioral analysis, and they will see if Calculator or Microsoft Word launches PowerShell scripts or VB scripts, like was mentioned, and those things are going to get flagged by a good EDR. There are ways to obfuscate that type of activity, but it's getting harder. And that's where EDRs are pretty powerful, especially if you're properly using them.
Hey, Mike, can I interrupt here for a second?
Please, yeah.
You just mentioned something that I think maybe someone that might be new to PowerShell may not have picked up on what you said. You may have covering this later on, but you just mentioned Notepad or Calculator or launching PowerShell. Like, how does that happen? What's going on there?
Yeah, and a great clarification. So Calculator, calc.exe is always one of those examples where you can use it to prove that you've got remote control over a system or remote code execution on a system. And so sometimes what you can do is have a application like calc.exe. You may patch it so that anytime that that executable runs, you have it spawn a different process. Or you may have a process embedded in a document, like a Word document where code execution can happen arbitrarily. Outlook's another good example. You can send full HTML-based emails and have those emails have JavaScript in them. And Outlook, surprisingly, you can use Outlook, the email tool, as a web browser, and it can run things like JavaScript in it. And so all of those types of really weird edge cases are where malicious threat actors love to live, because they're the things that are like, no one in their right mind would think to do that. But that's also the reason that they can get away with doing it, is because it's not obvious and it's probably something newer to most people out there. So it's a great clarification.
And to take that a step further, we started the beginning of this intro, when we did the intro, when we were talking about this default of PowerShell is bad. That's the example that the security team will often leverage to say, we need to turn this off because PowerShell is a tool. It can be used for good or for bad, and it's very universal and lots of different ways to execute that code. And so security team just thinks we've eliminated so much problems for ourselves, so we just shut that off, not realizing they just took down the efficiency of a whole team that's trying to manage a fleet of computers. And so that's the battle, right? That's everything in a nutshell. Like, proving to the security team that you have a clue as to what you're doing so that they have enough confidence to turn it on, because they're afraid that some dude is going to invoke PowerShell in ways that no one can ever envision or catch.
Yeah, you're spot on there, right? We are using this in a scoped, methodical approach, and this is the way we use it. Yeah, if you ever see somebody using it in a different way, turn it off. But this is how we use it, and that is a great nuance. We see it with break glass accounts as well. That's a different concept, tangential, but you may have systems where you have a backup administrator account that's only used for emergency purposes. Really good practice. Your security team should be looking through any activity logs, and the second they see that account active anywhere, they know something's going on. And if they know it's not an emergency that you're responding to, they probably need to shut it down. So it's all about helping your security team understand what's normal and what's abnormal and making it easier for them to protect the organization too. Great clarification.
I'll just add in one more thing.
Yeah.
Like if you're sort of new to PowerShell or new to systems administration, you might be saying to yourself, like, come on, guys, is people really executing stuff with calc.exe? And I won't speak for Michael, but this is all based on known things that have happened. This is not hypotheticals. This is activity that security teams, blue teams have seen all around the world. And so this is not stuff based on like this could happen. This has happened for many companies, and that's why these security teams have such a fear.
Yeah. No, you're spot on, and I was just gonna pull up so under MITRE, what I was referencing, right? This technique identifier. So threat actors use techniques and tactics and procedures themselves. And so if we look here, here's examples of where this technique, PowerShell, has been used for threat activity. Ukraine, AAD internals, Akira, Appleseed, APTs, all of these, Aquatic Panda. You thought I was joking about the honey bear being a threat actor, but it's going to come out one of these days. They're going to run out of names, just like they ran out of names for hurricanes and such and planets. But you can see, I mean, to Mike's point, there are so many examples of this, and it's out there. Your security team is justified in being scared of this tool if you do not manage it appropriately. I got close, Ember Bear.
Yeah, so the takeaway here is Mike's really illustrating that this is not theoretical stuff. This is very real world things that are happening in multiple environments. And if you've never seen it, be thankful, because that means you haven't been a part of, let's say, an attack, or you don't know that you've been a part of an attack. That's one of the other things. But it's constantly a game of attackers finding new methods that are yet undiscovered to find ways to infiltrate a network and stay undetected. And every time one is detected, it goes into these tools to help them find them. And so now the attackers have to find new methods. And it's a cat and mouse game that continues. And the onus goes on the teams that want to use these tools legitimately to show that you can use it in a responsible way and still protect against the list of stuff that you're seeing on the screen here and others of things that could possibly happen that are known vectors that have happened in the past. And so that's why the security teams are so anti-PowerShell or anti-tools in general that give lots of elevated access in the environment. PowerShell is not the only tool that gets a very high scrutiny. It's just the one that we're talking about tonight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to Mike's point, there's a list of scripting interpreters over here, and it is a common threat vector. Any attacker is going to look for the lowest common denominator. Microsoft has some very good guidance on this of making the threat actors' return on investment, the amount of effort they have to put in to maliciously attack your systems, making that effort so high that they just don't bother. That's really what we're getting at is if you put enough mitigations in place, there's a balance between operational efficiency and security. But if you find that balance for your environments, and we'll get into a bit here on segmentation strategies for that balance, but once you find that balance, you'll know, hey, we're doing enough that it's probably not going to be us in the news, and that threat actor is just going to move on to the next easy target. Good topics. As I mentioned, tiering, administrative tiering. So Microsoft has guidance through enhanced security administration environments. This is a older concept, but it's still valid concepts around administrative tiering. And they have modern guidance, which they call Security Rapid Modernization Plan, RAMP. Both of those have tremendously valuable content. They really help reinforce this idea of segmentation. We'll dive into code and sort of show examples of that in a second. But these segmentation strategies, just like we segment networks, just like we have firewalls, we need to segment permissions and make sure that not just anyone can run PowerShell. As I mentioned, there are people we know in their normal day-to-day should run PowerShell, our admins, as an example. Sally in accounting probably doesn't need to run PowerShell for her day job. This also includes non-human identities, which is becoming a massive threat vector. All of those AI agents running around because everyone on this call probably installed ClaudeBot and opened ports out to the internet, right? No, we all learned about that way back. We don't open ports to the internet anymore. But a lot of users are finding new tools that are very interesting and powerful and exposing themselves to risks unintentionally. And those tools are exposing your organization to risk, and you need ways to mitigate that. So keeping in mind non-human identities. This is always a hot topic, software restrictions. So Windows Defender application control, app blocker, software restriction policies is the legacy concept. It's a hard topic because usually the prerequisite capabilities aren't there. So we'll touch on that a little bit. I've got a breakdown where I stack rank some of these, and we can use that as a deeper diving point there. One of those prerequisites, though, is script signing. So making sure that you have execution policies set, and that also helps software restrictions. If you have a good code lifecycle practice, development lifecycle practice, some of these are pretty simple, but that may be newer to a lot of environments. Delegation management or just enough administration is a PowerShell concept. Phenomenal capability in PowerShell for you to allow a subset of commands to be used by certain resources. So let's say Sally's really cool, and she is actually importing CSVs and using groups and actually analyzing her data using PowerShell, because more power to her. Well, you can give her and her user profile a geo profile so that she has the commands that she would actually use and not things like stop process, which hopefully you've got endpoint privilege figured out and you aren't letting her run as an admin to begin with. But there's different environments and different nuances for all sorts of things. So preventing any code from running, then we get into we can access it from anywhere and you can access anywhere from it. So lateral movement, east-west is a hot topic. There's a lot of network response tools, NDR tools, network detection and response tools is the terminology, that monitor for this unusual or suspicious network activity to say, hey, why is this one workstation all of a sudden sending PowerShell WinRM sessions to 40 other workstations? That's unusual. Well, if it's an admin workstation, good. If it's some random computer that just downloaded malware, bad. We want to stop that. So understanding what your controls are here, even your channels. So WinRM is one way to do PowerShell remoting, but you can also use SSH now. You can also use Azure Arc and have SSH tunneling through the cloud through PowerShell. There's a lot of complexity here. Again, security teams are justified in wanting to turn this off as their default reaction because there's a lot of consideration we have to put into using this securely and doing this consciously. There's also outbound, which is host-based firewalls, and that's valuable for inbound too. But outbound especially, you want to segment devices as much as you can. Make sure that that normal activity is consistent. Last but not least, developers make mistakes, happens. Secret management's one example of that, right? I didn't show you my API key to my Azure OpenAI instance in Azure Foundry. You did not see that in the recording. I did not need to share that because it's all able to be passed in memory. But sometimes somebody somewhere hard-coded credentials. That's a bad practice. We want to avoid that. We don't want that showing up in logs. There's all sorts of considerations to manage that. And that goes into a bigger conversation around application security testing. There's full throttle frameworks out there. Some of this is already baked in with PowerShell. So the PowerShell team does have tools to do static code analysis. So if you're solving PowerShell as a security risk, you're ending up building some new capabilities and processes in your organization at the same time, if you want to do it fully and comprehensively. And so what does that look like? So up here in the green, these are the things that you probably have the existing technology, product, resources to do, and it's probably things that you're already doing day to day process-wise. So enabling logging and aggregating logging. Phil had a great talk at PowerShell Summit, I think 2024, about log aggregation and log forwarding. There's tons of resources for this. It's built into Windows. The Windows event system actually has Windows event forwarding and Windows event collectors. So you can centralize logs from multiple assets that way. EDRs, hopefully you're already running this. Microsoft actually includes, if you don't run a third-party EDR solution, the anti-malware scanning interface, AMSI, is built in to Windows now. And if there's malicious PowerShell code, you could literally copy it off the internet, paste it into a shell session, and it's going to be like, that looks sketchy. I'm not going to run that unless you allow it. So AMSI is enabled by default in most OSs these days. So that's helpful, but EDRs add to that. And then remoting, huge benefit. Use it, please. If you like PowerShell, remoting is your best friend, and you can secure it pretty safely, quickly. As we get into all these other things, this is where you're probably going to need a new process. This is going to be work. I say that because some organizations don't have things like software development life cycles, so a lot of this may be new. But as you tie together application security with script signing, with your secret management, with your software restrictions, that adds into delegation management. Those 5 things, I believe it was, 5 things, all are solved by good code management practices, good development practices. Check your code into a repository. Have the repository sign that code. Have the signed artifact published in a central repository for consumption. All of that you can do with Windows Server and some of the built-in tools, or you can integrate with open source tools as well. And those are able to be accomplished. You can do script signing internally with your own PKI. You can do it with self-signed certs. There are considerations for scaling that, but all of that combines to improve your maturity of publishing, and it makes your management so much easier. Because one of the biggest challenges when enabling software restrictions is PowerShell by default runs in constrained language mode. And so language modes in PowerShell basically restrict what PowerShell can do. So what commands are available, what types of features and capabilities in the PowerShell shell you can actually use. When you enable Defender App Control, constrained language mode is enabled, unless you're running a pre-approved script, and scripts that are signed and validated from a trusted publisher are pre-approved. So you need a process for handling exceptions when you need to disable those software restrictions. And then you need a process for making sure that you're publishing anything that's ready for prime time in a comprehensive and mature manner so that you don't have to disable software restrictions. So that's all to say, this all fits together. These all are additive. Some of these do take a lot of effort, though, especially if you don't even have a starting point yet. Any questions before I flip over to some code?
I think one of the comments is that, some people are talking in chat. It's like, this slide is like almost like gold at this point. And I think the nuance here is that you could take each item here and actually have its own talk just about each one. Hey, as you mentioned, hey, successfully auditing information. That's one. Hey, script signing. What does a really good script signing process look like? And you walk through, hey, just check your code in, have it automatically signed, have the artifacts automatically signed. So yeah. That's just sure anybody can do that, but hey, there's a nuance there, and some of the other auditing is like, hey, just turn on script logging, and like that's a simple thing, but it's not necessarily completely simple.
Yep.
App restrictions. Hey, what does it really look like to turn on? Or to audit app blocker. And then, hey, what do we do for secret management? Where do we keep those secrets? Is it, and ultimately delegate administration? That's kind of interesting. So it's almost like this slide is like gold, but hey, let's talk about each one of these as its own topic. So I think it's really good to talk about that point. So
yeah, great clarification. Was there another comment too?
Oh, no, I think we're good.
Cool. So
I'm looking at this list of the highs, and it's kind of the promised land, if you will, on what people try to go after. But man, do people struggle with things like script signing and secret management. They're better at secret management because Key Vault in Azure and some other tools make that easier. I don't remember what the AWS and the GCP versions of those are off the top of my head. But like host firewall, you're running into a buzzsaw if you're not paying attention to the amount of effort that it's going to take to put on a host firewall.
Yeah, the extreme example of that when we get into administrative tiering. So the legacy name for ESAE was Red Forest. And quick sidebar, the entire concept of Red Forest is you have your operational forest, your green forest, or your resource forest, and then you have your management forest, and it's your red forest, and you'd have a red forest for each tier. Well, your tier 0, your crown jewels red forest, is managing the tier 0 assets in your operational forest. And taking that to an extreme, the Windows host-based firewall's phenomenally powerful. It's amazing how massive of a resource it is. But in those tier 0 operating environments, it's not uncommon for us to want to also implement dedicated IPsec tunneling at the host-based firewall level. The Windows firewall will establish IPsec tunnels using certificates and full IKE encryption and IKE phases And those tunnels will be point to point based on firewall rules, where you can even use group memberships and certificate templates to manipulate what's allowed or not for which specific executables. And so we get into this whole argument of, we do segmentation, then we do micro segmentation at a VLAN level, and then we do nano segmentation at a process level. And there's so many layers. Phil mentioned it. There's each of these could be a talk. Stephen, you mentioned it, like that one thing could be a year's worth of implementation in most environments.
Well, in most environments, it's good, but the comment that we often say is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Hey, are we that critical of a company, or do we have the technical staff to manage that environment, or what does that learning curve look like to bring new staff on? Or we bring in an external vendor and well, they go, oh, well, we just assume that you have admin rights and just run the install. Like, whoa, no, but you need to walk through that. Let me explain to you what our security posture looks like. And that's the struggle with some, even vendors coming along. Oh no, I just assume that you're going to just blindly run all this anywhere and just give the machine admin rights, or that's the simple thing. But on top of now, you're talking inter-process communication and like, God help me, like, is it worth some of that? And most companies aren't that stringent, or maybe they're in the regulatory environment. Some of them would be, but even when I worked in healthcare, HIPAA was a beast, but you know what? We still jumped through a lot of hoops, even though, and it wasn't as stringent as some of those things could be.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciated this slide because, like, not only like I love that you show like low effort, high benefit, like, so companies, like, those are the easy ones to tackle. They might be able to say, hey, let's try and tackle these 3 things this year, and then one of the highs next year or whatever. But I really appreciated this slide because it showed kind of what's out there. Like, I didn't even know some of this existed, right? Or that this was something that we needed to be concerned about. And so I just mentioned, like, it would be great just to have like a blog post about like, just these are the whatever 10, 12 things, whatever they are, with links to more information where people can learn more about them and decide, is it worth, the effort versus the benefit versus the risk, right? It depends on the company, depends what industry they're in and all of that. But just like having it kind of all in one spot, being like, these are the things you should be concerned about, or at least just know about. And then you can decide whether you want to implement them or not. And, how much effort it's going to be to implement them, and how much benefit you're going to get out of that. Just like that summary blog post almost, right, with links to more additional information. Like, I feel like this slide alone is super valuable, but if you expanded that out, I feel like that would be amazing.
You are officially my MC for future presentations, because the Australian Signals Directorate, ASD, think of them sort of like what, if you're familiar, CISA, DISA, there's federal agencies under the DoD that manage IT policy and standards, because they have to apply standards to hundreds of operating entities. ASD is an Australian team that focuses on a lot of this. And they have provided a phenomenal starting point for this. Exactly what you were mentioning, right? And so they have in their appendix, and I will pop out of this so we can jump into the fun now. They have this published, and this is super helpful. This is super valuable. They give you context of this. And then at the bottom here, they also have their recommendations for how to prioritize this, which was mentioned too. Where should we start? How do we get further along in this? They even have a nice visual down here. I'm scrolling pretty fast, but they've got this visual that sort of represents how they recommend approaching things. And in these appendixes, they actually give you the GPO guidance of how to apply a lot of these settings. And we talked about audit policies and logging in PowerShell. It's so simple. There's only these 15 things we need to worry about. And that's really what we're getting into. We've hit it, we've beat it up, but there are so many ways to do this, and each one of these becomes its own little nuanced world, like transcripting. Great, we're publishing those transcriptions into a folder. How do we get those centralized? Oh, but wait, we're putting those transcriptions into a directory. How do we make sure that the user who's creating that doesn't have the ability to delete that? So we've got to deny the creator owner permission and that well-known SID. And then how do we make sure that users can't accidentally manipulate the registry so they turn off script transcription? So we've talked through it. There's a lot of layers to this, but this is a great resource as a starting point. I would say if you're doing even level 2 of this, you're already well protected from the average threat. There's certainly more you can do. There's certainly more you should strive to do, but this is a great reference point. Is this helpful?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I'm going to see if I can find the actual link, or you just post it into chat. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'll drop it in there.
Well, I know what I'm doing for the rest of my life.
Well, it may not be that much time out of your life, Stephen. I've got something for you. If you say you want it, I'll give it to you.
Heck yeah.
One of the things.
Give it to me, baby. Give it to me.
One of the things that I was reviewing with this is, right, this is great information. It's awesome that they gave us all that stuff. How do we get it implemented? So I've started laying out some options for this, and I'm more than willing to change this prefix identifier. So if you've got suggestions, I will take them. PS Hard isn't necessarily my desired name for the module, but I've started codifying their guidance along with some of my own guidance and some of the things our teams use to start laying this out into. We want to harden signing in our environment, or we want to implement logging in our environment. And I joked, but logging is 4 different things when we're talking about PowerShell. You have your audit log, you have your module logs, you have your script block logging, and you've got your transcriptions. And that's before you get into the operational logs. That's just your auditing. So how do we get all of that codified, easier to implement, to Stephen's point, so that you aren't spending a ton of time and a ton of effort trying to break all this down? And building on that, like I mentioned, also giving guidance of how to map into things like administrative tiering. So one of the things we run into anytime we're talking about tiering or we're working with entities implementing RAMP is, I understand that I should tier, but I don't really understand how to apply tiering. And PowerShell, fortunately, is one of those things that in a Windows environment, it's going to be there. You're going to have to figure out how to manage it. And as you should be managing tiering for every application that is in multiple tiers, you should be managing PowerShell in every tier. As we used the example, you probably should not have tier 2 operators in a tiering model. Tier 2 is generally your endpoints, your workstations. Tier 1 are your servers, and then tier 0 are like domain controllers or certificate authorities. Your tier 2 operators probably don't need to use PowerShell. There is exceptions. You may want your help desk. If you've got an awesome help desk that's really knowledgeable, you may want them to use PowerShell. Or you may publish them signed scripts that they can run in the production environment to provide easier troubleshooting processes. But we're getting into a lot of nuance here. And it was mentioned too, like this isn't necessarily right for every environment. This level of granularity is a lot of operational overhead. But you can use this as a starting point of asking the question, is this valuable to us? And then if code like this is able to pull back the entry point to getting some of this deployed, maybe that operational overhead is lower as well. So that's sort of my closing final note of I have a starting point. I have probably, I'd say 50% of the ASD's guidance codified. If this is something that y'all would think is useful and would want it, I would be happy to share this in a Git repository publicly and walk through it on this call as long as y'all want to.
Well, I'd certainly want to, look at it more. So even if putting it on GitHub and getting some collaboration towards it, it'd certainly make it, easier at that point. And then the idea of, taking the pieces that are more consumable than others. So that is, again, back to my analogy, is the juice worth the squeeze? How much can you absorb without, breaking somebody else, and hey, that's not something I can manage beyond. It's you got two people in the entire organization of 10,000 who can manage that environment. That's just not sustainable, right? You need a team to do that, and what's it take to elevate the team to achieve those goals?
Yeah.
So I would say, so Mike, I mean this as a compliment. Um, I don't think people understand the scope of what you presented tonight. And the reason I say that is you really did a really magnificent job of wrapping this up and making it digestible. But as we were commenting on that one slide, that's very honestly, for most teams, multi-years worth of work. And you've summarized a multi-year process in 45 minutes or so of slides and demos. So really great job of presenting just a crap ton of information in a digestible way. But the truth is, for the people watching at home, this is a topic that consumes teams entirely. There are teams that just do this. And some people might say the trade-offs are not worth it for the amount of work putting in until there's some risk event and you know that you have some protections in place. But you, you really, you need to think of this as like a journey. You're on a path and you just make regular iterative steps along the way to increase your security footprint. You may never get to the end of the line or may not be appropriate for your environment, but there needs to be an actual understanding. Like there is no team I've ever met that is sitting around with nothing to do, right? There's always lots of work to do. And for most teams, this feels like extra work outside of their normal scope of work. It's usually being driven by a security team that wants them to put this in place. There's not a lot of teams that go, you know what, we really want to make it hard for us to get around the environment. So there's just a lot of work involved in this stuff. These tools make it easier, but if you're interested in this stuff, you need to set the expectation. Like the very first step could be weeks, just getting started. And not only because it could be hard to do, but you really need to understand the impact of what you turned on. You can turn something on and you don't realize what it's doing. You really need to understand, like, what did I just turn on? What does that actually do? And so that takes time. This is a new learning opportunity for most people. If you're new to this, there's just tons of information to absorb to understand the impact. Because the one thing that's not mentioned here, and I know why Michael didn't go here, but all this stuff comes with CPU cycles that have to, as a trade-off on the devices that manage and all this stuff. And there's this risk versus performance benefit on the machines that you put it on. And so there's just so much stuff to think about here. And so if you're interested in this topic, we've had topics about this, some sections of this in the past. You can go back in our catalog and look at it, but these are really topics that will consume large quantities of your time.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great call out too, Mike. And transcription's a good example of that, right? Is
Yeah.
if you're using PowerShell a lot and you're logging transcription logs, guess what? You're filling up your disk. So what's your process? What's the scheduled task look like that's going to purge out those transcription logs from 5 years ago on that system that has been running a PowerShell job every night?
Yeah. And
Or
I'll
even
say
where to
that,
forward it to, so that, hey, as your like DC log, you know what, we just want to watch the DCs, but they roll, within hours. I'm like, well, that doesn't do me any good.
I did a talk on this at PowerShell Saturday back in, I think, 2021 or something. I don't remember. But this script you have here is really the closest I've ever personally seen of someone coming into making this somewhat of an automatable process. This has always been a big work item, a lot of hand work, a lot of manual stuff. So that's pretty cool to see how well thought out this is. I'm just wondering how long this took to produce. Must have been quite a bit of work.
Um, I'm sure somebody's snickering at my module creation process here of just slapping it all into a big file and working through it. Um, but honestly, it works well for me. So I'd probably say maybe 10 hours into this so far. And even if you double that, because engineers are horrible at estimating their effort, right?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I put some time into this, but like I said, it's only, I'd even call it 50% at best. But
Hmm.
a lot of the concepts are laid out there. So
That's
one of,
it's a cool concept though.
yeah, and one of my nasty habits is I'll doing things like this, especially the newer individuals out there who some of these concepts may be new to. Like, there's a lot in here that I covered that may be new to you, but understand too, some of this I dig into these concepts because I want to understand them better. And when I'm doing something like this, I'll go off on super deep random tangents. This is a great example here. The default path for system 32 is the default path until you change what the default mount point for the system drive is from the C drive. So if you've been in an environment where that's happened, you know about that. If you haven't, you're sort of like, wait, what? And so some of these random things you can go off on tangents for hours just to figure out those little nuances. So,
One of the things that wasn't mentioned that is worth noting is when you were going through all the earlier stuff about the compliance and the regulations and the different standards that are out there. I mean, I've been through some audits. I had a team that was involved with the boarding processes, and so there's rigor put around making sure that accounts are off-boarded in a certain amount of time and done in a certain way. And the reason, the reason it's valuable to not start here when Mike's presentation tonight is because you kind of have to understand the audits, because I will tell you that I have worked with auditors that have asked for information or had made suggestions, and it's quite apparent that the auditor doesn't understand what they're asking you to do. And so another layer to this whole thing is, besides just setting all this stuff, is understanding what these compliance frameworks are trying to achieve. There's nothing that says the auditors that are in your environment, looking at your environment, are asking you to put on settings that actually make sense for what you guys do. I've had auditors ask me for things and go like, I know what you want, but that is not a possibility in this scenario. So I think the reason that the compliance stuff is important in the beginning is to understand the rat's nest of stuff that comes when you start to get into companies that have these compliance frameworks. I hate to say it, but it's essentially you versus them, right? It's the auditors want data, or they want to understand why things are in place, and you have to justify why you did it a certain way. And they get the assumption that they're right and you're wrong, and it's kind of on you to kind of sort of set them straight. I don't want to say prove them wrong, but set them straight when maybe what they're saying doesn't jive with what you think is going on.
Yeah,
That's happened to me a lot.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I like to joke that when you get a significantly mature enough security and governance risk environment, you're just doing exception management. And a story like Mike is just referencing, I'll share, where I was on the other side and I made a recommendation. So doing M365 hardening and auditing of M365 tenants, yeah, Exchange Online, disable Exchange Web Services, the legacy SOAP-based API for Exchange. Microsoft's trying to move away from it. It's legacy. There's better ways. Use the better ways. That's all fine and dandy. That is a valid recommendation until you turn it off and you realize that the Teams calendar still uses the EWS APIs, and all of a sudden Teams calendar stopped working. So
that only applies
it's not
if you had a previous environment. If you didn't have on-prem before, it's kind of nuanced. It's like if you were in this boat, if you had that legacy stuff, then it applies to you. Otherwise, it never applies. So that is the history there too. It is a dangerous thing as far as is you want to understand that contact and that technical debt that you need to assume is that Exchange is one of those places where once it's implemented, it's really hard to rip out.
Mhm.
All right, Mike. Thanks, man. That was good, and I definitely want to hear some more about. I really want to see that code. So if you're gonna, are you gonna post it, or if you can share it, I'd like to even see it because I want to see what I could do to implement in our environment, or at least, share it with others and see what their tolerance is to try and implement something like that.
Yeah, gladly. I'll whip up a public repo and I can even drop the slides in there probably. So sometimes PowerPoint doesn't play well with GitHub, but we'll figure that out.
Yeah. And
So
if anybody has any other questions, this is certainly a good opportunity to come off mute and ask questions.
So I think we're gonna. I think I want to say first of all, thank you to Mike for the kind of caught me off guard with a sneaky good presentation tonight. Really a great set of information that gives people a lot to go back and really dive into. So fantastic job tonight with the information, and thank you for sharing the information with us. Oh my God, what do we got going on with Stephen Judd?
His hat's on.
So after this presentation, I just wanted everyone to know that I'm a soul man now.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen, we don't know why we let Stephen Judd into meetings, but we love him and we let him do what he does. On that note, we are going to say good night to everyone on behalf of our Research Triangle PowerShell user group. Thank you again to Michael Sewell for giving us a fantastic demo tonight. If you're watching this online, the magic is joining us in person because you get to ask the questions and see it tailored exactly to your needs. If you'd like to join us in person, take a look at our website, rtpsug.com, or you can find us on Meetup. Look for RTP Sug. We'll see you at the next one. Thanks and take care, everyone.